Welcome to our webcast, Rebooting CFO-CIO Collaboration, brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by Workday. I'm Joe Fleischer, and I'll be your moderator. I'd like to tell you about and introduce you to our distinguished guests. They are Peter Elkins, Group Editor with the thought leadership and research firm Longitude, a Financial Times company. Joe Wilson, North America Chief Technology Officer with Workday. Renee Budig, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer with CBS Interactive. And Gary Piscatelli, Senior Vice President and North America Chief Financial Officer with Hunter Douglas. Now, during this webcast, Peter Elkins, who I mentioned is Group Editor with the research and thought leadership firm Longitude, will share findings about barriers to collaboration between CFOs and CIOs. He'll also share what CFOs can do to remove these barriers. We will then conduct an in-depth discussion about this very topic with Peter and with Joe, Renee, and Gary. Now, before we hear from Peter, I'd like to pose the first of our three polling questions. And our first polling question asks attendees to indicate the extent to which you agree with the following statement. My company's CFO and CIO collaborate effectively and typically agree on how to achieve my company's goals. What you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the submit button so we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. Now, we ask that you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer and then click on the submit button so we can record the extent to which you agree or disagree with a statement that your company's CFO and CIO collaborate effectively and typically agree on how to achieve your company's goals. What we'll do is give attendees just one more second to respond. We will then reveal and summarize how you have responded, and then we will hear from Peter. And what we can already see is that, fortunately, a majority agree, but I would acknowledge that there probably could be more strong agreement than there is. So clearly, roughly about 3/4 of respondents agree. That's very, very good, and close to a sixth strongly agree. So that's also very good, but there's always opportunity to move the needle. In particular, I would acknowledge the 10% who don't even know. I think that's something to pay attention to, in addition to the more than 13% who at the very least disagree. Well, with that in mind, I'd like to now turn the floor over. Indeed, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Peter Elkins of Longitude. Please give a warm welcome to him. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks to everyone who has joined the call. I thought I'd start by setting the context for this presentation, and really the context is disruption, and in particular technology disruption, the impact of technologies that range from artificial intelligence to intelligent automation to cloud computing and everything in between. Our kind of starting hypothesis was that in this environment, effective and strong C-suite collaboration is a must-have, because basically the complex questions that these technologies are posing for businesses, the way that they are rewriting the rules of business, the way they are transforming operating performance, really are complex questions. And if you come to those questions with integrated expertise, with integrated solutions, you'll be able to solve those questions. If you try and address those questions purely from your own silo, your own function, your own team, our hypothesis is that you will have suboptimal solutions or will struggle to answer those questions. So we wanted to look at how effectively CFOs were collaborating with other members of the C-suite. So we did a large survey. We sent a questionnaire, to over 670 finance leaders around the world. So that's Americas, that's Africa, that's Europe, that's Asia Pacific, to kind of shine a spotlight in particular on the relationship between finance and IT, between CFOs and CIOs. And we wanted to understand more about how finance teams and their leaders, their senior executives, and can collaborate effectively with the IT team. So our research confirmed that this is a really critical relationship, the one between the CFO and the CIO, particularly in a digital age. So we had close to 3/4 of finance leaders said that strong CFO-CIO collaboration is critical if you're going to drive technology innovation. And this really reflects the world that we're in as companies. We are trying to put in place omni-channel customer experiences. We're trying to automate operations. We're trying to employ advanced data analytics to change the way that we make strategic decisions. And to do that, you're going to have to make some quite bold investment decisions. And you're going to have to make sure that those investment decisions are aligned to corporate strategy. And you're also going to have to do all that, which is difficult enough in itself, with managing the risks of technology innovation. And they can be everything from information security and cyber risk and others. And because of this convergence that we're seeing of technology, investment strategy and risk, our belief is that the CFO-CIO relationship is more important today than it's ever been in the past. That's not to say it hasn't been important in the past. It clearly has, but it's that convergence which is different today. But the issue is while the finance leaders that we surveyed recognize the strategic importance of that relationship, we found actually that the relationship between CFO and CIO is the weakest of all the C-suite relationships. So in our research, we looked at the whole spectrum of relationships that the CFO enjoys in a typical C-suite. And we asked the finance leaders, where do you enjoy a really seamless collaboration where you can put your hand on your heart and you can say, I as CEO and the CMO or a CIO or our Chief Operating Officer have common goals and priorities. And we found actually that while that seamless collaboration was rare across the board, it was interesting that the CFO-CIO relationship is in a sense perceived in the most negative light. In fact, out of all the relationships that the CFO has, we found fewest people were prepared to say that these two leaders really enjoyed a strong rapport, a strong relationship, a strong collaboration. And we also looked into why that might be, what's amplifying that, how strong feelings are. We wanted to get a sense of the sentiment of finance leaders, and we got some strong sentiment emerging, in fact. So we found that 2/3 of finance leaders said that they felt IT executives are reluctant to collaborate, and over half, so 55%, were even prepared to say that the relationship is characterized by tension and disagreement. And we can guess at what those tensions might be. It might be that finance is quick to pounce on any area which it perceives as overspending. IT may have a drive to invest in new technology assets, and maybe those two kind of priorities end up clashing. We also wanted to look at some of the issues that were undermining that relationship, and we found that 2/3 of finance leaders said that IT and finance don't speak the same language, that communication and understanding barriers are a significant problem. So let me give you an example. of what that actually means. Finance people may believe that IT don't talk about technology initiatives in terms of their business benefits and value, and their contribution to the organization's strategic goals. The IT people may feel that finance lacks understanding of the issues that IT faces and how IT operates. So IT may feel that you people in finance, you don't understand the cybersecurity dimensions of this problem. You don't perhaps comprehend how we're trying to use agile development approaches. So it's that lack of kind of mutual understanding. So this is, from our survey, is clearly an issue. What can be done about it? How can we think about building bridges between these two leaders? And I think one way is for IT to understand where the CFO and finance function can actually make a contribution to IT's agenda and make IT people's lives better, as it were. And I think IT strategy is a key area. And I don't use the phrase IT strategy loosely. IT is no longer a cost of doing business. IT today is about how you build a winning business model, how you use your data, how you monetize your data, how you use your data for better decision making, how technology can better meet customer needs, how you can deliver a winning digital customer experience. So IT strategy is absolutely clear and critical. And CIOs, therefore, they must paint a picture of how technology is going to move the business's innovation agenda forward. So it's about innovation now. And there are ways that finance can help CIOs and IT achieve those goals. One area that suggests itself would be to utilize finance's expertise in predictive analytics. I mean, for example, drawing on all the data that finance has at its disposal, which will include both pure finance data, but also operational marketing data, other forms of data from the organization. You could model how an investment in IT, the impact of that investment, is it going to reduce risk? Is it going to improve operational efficiency, and to what degree, and what KPIs can be put in place to model that return in terms of operational improvement? What contribution could be made to revenue growth targets from a particular strategic investment in technology? And by doing that, you are solving a lot of the problems that have undermined the relationship, because at that point, the IT team are thinking and speaking in the language of the CIO, in language of the CEO and the CFO, and they're even to a certain extent thinking in the language of investors and boards and other stakeholders in the organization. So it could be very powerful. I'm sure there are other areas where finance can help IT, but that seems a very productive and exciting area to pursue. I just want to finish off by looking at some of the more kind of pragmatic actions and recommendations that people on this call, on this WebEx, people who read the session can think about and maybe utilize within their organization. Finance and IT working effectively together means they must overcome communication barriers. And there are three areas where finance people can play a part in that. First, I think finance people can build their understanding of advanced technologies such as blockchain, such as machine learning. What are the use cases for blockchain in finance? What impact is it going to have on accounting and reporting, one of the kind of major planks of finance? Attending conferences, attending seminars, often difficult with people's busy agendas, but increasingly important to separate that time for digital learning for a finance person. And IT can help in this regard by organising demos for finance leaders. I interviewed one finance leader who said that the IT person uses their contacts in startups, in artificial intelligence startups, to come in and demonstrate the impact of technologies for CFOs and their immediate senior team. So there's very practical steps that you can take. The second thing that finance leaders can do is make sure that CIOs are aware of the key priorities of important stakeholders such as boards, such as audit committees. If you involve IT in this dialogue with those stakeholders such as finances, communications and dialogue with investors, you can help make sure that technology strategy is aligned with business strategy in that way. If the CIO has insight into what is preoccupying investors, what is preoccupying board members, then IT strategy can be tailored and also messaged accordingly. And thirdly, CFOs can encourage their staff to rotate into IT, or they can make their finance staff available for digital transformation initiatives within the wider organization. I think we are getting to a stage where the old linear career path in finance it's time for change. It probably already is changing. I think the successful CFOs in the next 10 years, they're not necessarily just going to progress up the finance ladder within the finance function all of their career. I think they will pick up wider IT transformation operational experience. So I'd like to conclude there. I would just reiterate what I said at the beginning. I think there's a strong case to argue in a disrupted age that the relationship between finance and IT has never been more important. I hope this session has been helpful in thinking about how that relationship can be improved. And I would just say thank you for taking the time to listen. And I'll now hand back to Joe for the rest of the session.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And you've really laid the groundwork for a discussion that will include you as well as your fellow panelists. Now, before we transition to our discussion with Peter, Joe, Renee, and Gary, we would like to pose our second of three polling questions. Our second polling question asks attendees to indicate the extent to which you agree with the statement that your company's CFO and CIO share the same understanding about the role of technology in supporting your company's growth. What you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the submit button so we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. After you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, we do ask that you click on the submit button so we can record the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement that your company's CFO and CIO share the same understanding about the role of technology in supporting your company's growth. Give attendees just one more second to respond. We'll then reveal and summarize how you have responded, and then we will launch into our discussion. And what we can see here is that there is clearly a majority of respondents who agree. That said, I would be remiss if I did not point out that about a sixth at the very least disagree. And again, we have percentage, more than 13%, who don't know. I think what we want to do now is launch into our discussion with Peter, Joe, Renee, and Gary. And in beginning this discussion, I think perhaps most important is to consider the priorities of senior executives, and in particular, senior finance executives and senior IT executives. And so with that in mind, I'd like to pose our first question to our distinguished guests. I want to pose this question first to Gary Piscatelli of Hunter Douglas and then Joe Wilson of Workday. And this question is, to what extent are the priorities of CFOs aligning with those of CIOs, and in what key areas do these priorities diverge, starting with Gary and then Joe?
Hi, this is Gary. Thanks very much. You know, it was interesting looking at some of those statistics, and generally speaking, even though I saw in some cases there's some divergence, but in a lot of those measures in terms of criticality, agreement, and the role, you know, there was in excess of 69% agreement. And when I think about the CFO and the CIO and trying to make sure that priorities are aligned, it's a little bit easier for me. In my last two roles, the CIO has reported to me. And, you know, that certainly makes it easier for us to be on the same page when we're regularly sharing, you know, company priorities and objectives. But even in places where that doesn't happen, you know, generally speaking, if you've got a good process of cascading from your strategy annual objectives that, you know, are then cascaded across your executive team and then cascaded downward within your divisions or business units or functions, you know, it's a really good way of driving alignment. And even here at Hunter Douglas, although the CIO reports to me, we still, you know, follow that process. And I thought it was really interesting when we had the discussion about, you know, strategy and IT strategy. And I've thought about, in some cases, where there is a little bit of divergence. And, you know, where I find there's divergence is when the, you know, either IT or finance is overly focused on their function versus the company. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as an IT strategy or a finance strategy that isn't there to support the strategies of the overall company. And what usually creates divergence is when either function is more interested in their function than trying to support the goals, objectives, or strategies of the company. But in companies that do a really good job of communicating their strategies clearly, cascade objectives to support those strategies clearly, tie objectives and compensation into attainment of those strategies, you know, things generally work okay. That's,
thank you very much. Thank you, Gary. And I think that's a really great point, by the way, that, you know, ultimately there is a company strategy. That said, Joe, from your perspective, and particularly from your current perspective as Chief Technology Officer, but also in general based on your experience, Joe, what are your thoughts in response to this question?
Well, I actually think Gary's spot on when he talks about the necessity of strategies and goals being laid out for the organization and then ensuring they cascade across the operational areas of the organization. So that regardless of hierarchy or structure or however you're formed, you have to make sure that you're effectively singing from that same sheet of music, to use maybe an analogy that's probably too played out at this point. But I would also offer up that money is often the constraint for all organizations, right? We all want more. We have a finite amount of it, and then how do we maximize the impact based on the limited resource that we have available to us? Unless you're Google and then you just print your own. That's a story for another day. But so that's probably where the most competing priorities manifest themselves, is in that kind of that bid for limited or precious resource called spend. And obviously the CFO has a very unique role in that. The charter lies to spend wisely and to account for it specifically, and very much from a fiduciary responsibility of the organization. But that doesn't relieve anybody, and I mean anybody, from carrying that responsibility to keep focus on those organizational goals, whether it's the CHRO, the CMO, the CSO, whatever C you want to put in front of whatever term, all need to be aligned. And so maybe the divergence happens around that precious spend that's available, or in some cases not available. but also sometimes maybe a divergence of priorities manifest when the alignment is a little bit too constrained. And by that, sometimes when we look at all those lines of business, whether it's outside of the CFO domain, think about the CHRO stovepipe, think about the sales CSO or CMO stovepipe. IT often has to serve the needs across the business. It's not just aligned to finance. So making sure that finance has an eye for the business, it's not just being the gatekeeper or the guardian of money, but also understanding that it has to enable the business and that IT as a forcing function of that is able to create real value as it provides that domain expertise or that domain knowledge across all the lines. So certainly there's an alignment opportunity. I think there's a lot of that we saw, I think, to Gary's point in the survey. It's good to see this happening. There's still some opportunities specifically around how monies are allocated, helping people understand that it's not all or nothing, that we can all win in a limited resource environment. And then also making sure that as we look across the scope of business, to that last point I mentioned, that IT serves not only within finance, but across all domains, and finance has a unique opportunity to influence and support, and quite frankly, enable success in all.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I think we're going to certainly come back to this, the notion that even if there are limited resources doesn't mean that everybody can't win. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to pose our next question. Peter, I want to revisit your findings that you shared, and then Gary, I want to return to you, given the perspective you shared earlier. But returning to you first, Peter, and again, revisiting some of the research findings, in what ways are CFOs collaborating effectively with CIOs within their companies, and what are the key factors that foster this collaboration, starting with Peter and then Gary?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, I think I alluded to this as you mentioned. One area is clearly the digitization of finance, which is, quite frankly, is just really exciting. If you think about a future finance function where all transactional finance processes are completely automated, where artificial intelligence tools are trawling through reams of data, where potentially, though this is still to be decided, whether blockchain has completely transformed the kind of basic accounting structures. It's a really exciting future. Again, to try and give you a real example, I recently spoke to a finance leader, and she had set up an innovation group within her finance team with the support of the CIO. And basically what this involved is every month she gathered her senior finance people, and as well as some of the kind of leading lights from the IT team. And the IT team would share latest technology developments, their understanding of advanced technologies such as machine learning, their understanding of some of the use cases within the organization. And this was a way of stimulating ideas within the minds of the finance executives about how to drive the digitization of finance, and obviously at a personal level fostered a kind of stronger relationship and collaboration between finance and IT. I think what it does imply, though, is finance needs to have an open mind and a willingness to experiment. This finance leader, she was willing to run pilots, to experiment, to make some bets, and I think that's going to be really important. But I think that's obviously a critical area, finance transformation through advanced technologies, and it's clearly an area where finance and IT can have a very productive collaboration.
Thank you very much, Peter. Gary, as I return to you, and before we consider obstacles with our next question, I want to talk about and hear your thoughts on the optimal conditions for CFOs and CIOs to collaborate. Gary, I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and it really builds on, the answers to question one that I think, both Joe and I mentioned, and that's around, having organizational clarity around strategy and objectives, and it helps a lot. But when you get down into the details, and I'll speak more to the positive side of where finance and IT will collaborate. A lot of it has to do with mutual understanding of how value is created. And it doesn't have to be as newfangled as blockchain or automation or robotics, which are certainly trending right now, but it can be even as basic as having an effective ERP implementation, or having a really good data strategy so you have sound information decision making, which may sound like table stakes these days, but if you talk to most CFOs, even in very large companies, it's not always the case, right? So there's a lot of basic fundamental blocking and tackling that still isn't in place as well as it could be to drive a lot of value in a lot of large companies. And where finance and IT can share a vision as to how technology can help enable that, then it's much easier to collaborate and work together and get things done. The flip side of that, and I think Peter spoke to this a little bit when he was talking about where there might be a disconnect between IT and finance, it's around communication and selling. And on both sides, but even more so in IT, there isn't necessarily the strongest acumen to build business cases and then sell things using layman's terms that folks will understand and get behind as to how that's going to create value. And value at the end of the day is about higher sales and higher profits, right? And the ability to do that within IT and build a business case is not so strong. And unfortunately, a lot of the software companies that are selling applications, with all due respect to Workday, which I think has a great product, the finance folks generally can be somewhat skeptical of those business cases. So you have to actually be able to build a business case that is rooted in your company that actually makes sense, that's real, and that you can sell. And if both finance and IT can get behind those things and work on those things, then they can both get excited about doing things together. But it's not always easy to get them on the same page in terms of building a business case.
Thank you, Gary. We've talked about positive. I think, given the premise of the webcast, I think it would be instructive at this point to consider the challenges and particularly how to address and overcome challenges. So with that in mind, I'd like to pose our next question first to Joe, return to Joe of Workday, Renee of CBS Interactive, return to you, Gary, and then Peter, question of primary reasons CFOs encounter obstacles to collaborating effectively with CIOs. So again, starting with Joe, then Renee, then Gary, then Peter.
All right, so I have to be careful here and say, first of all, I want to be abundantly clear that I enjoy an incredible relationship with my organization's CFO. So Robin, if you're listening, I don't foresee any obstacles, so thanks for your leadership. Joking aside, I would also probably put forward that a healthy CFO-CIO relationship it's often linked to the financial well-being of the enterprise. I think there's numerous studies out there that talk about when partnership is solid, when organizational goals are cascading and aligning across the enterprise, typically the financial results are better. To Gary's point, that's kind of generating profit, whatever industry it might be. But in a recent study I was reviewing, I noted that there was two concerns specifically for the future of this critical peer-level union. And the first was the need to balance the responsibility to maintain cost discipline, right, from the CFO's perspective, with more strategic ambitions, which is often something that I think the IT agenda tries to drive forward with. So, for example, setting the agenda for change. But unless you're in the business of government, where you can spend all you want and not really worry about it, cost discipline is actually vitally important. But I also want to caveat to say that while it is vitally important, I don't think it can be viewed in isolation from other potentially transformational activities. And I know that word transformational or transformation is literally buzzword du jour lately. But the idea of being able to do something today that you could not do yesterday with the application of new technology, and I'm not going to say all the other terms that have already been mentioned because, like Gary, they're a little bit edgy sometimes. we have to be able to view them not in just isolation, but holistically, right? Specifically in this kind of world that we're in where change is accelerating by day. So for this first concern, I would say that the need to balance the responsibility between cost discipline with strategic agenda is really focused on the word balance. I think balance is key. So that's probably one of the primary obstacles that we often see in the relationship between the CFO-CIO. But the second concern might be a mutual lack of understanding between these two peers, which is based in part on root issues like, and I look at this foundationally, maybe an organizational structure that prevents really close collaboration, right? So at the foundational level, if the org structure is not defined in such a manner that allows for that type of collaboration to exist, well, then you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. The second maybe on that rung might be a lack of finance resources to dedicate to the IT agenda, right? Again, IT is literally having to look across the enterprise. It cannot be myopic in nature. It's serving the needs of the human capital folks. It's serving the needs of sales. It's serving the needs of operations, and certainly serving the needs of finance. But there has to be a dedication across all lines of business to be embedded or imbued within that larger agenda setting strategy so that nobody is left out, and that the control of spend, again, to that limited resource, that finite resources of money, is able to be made judiciously. Moving up a ladder, I think, maybe is an absence of clear KPIs. So garbage in, garbage out, right? We've heard that a lot, but if we can't measure what we're doing, well, then are we actually doing anything right? And I think measurement is one of the key areas that we should focus on, specifically to mitigate those obstacles. And then the fourth would be an insufficient understanding of IT issues amongst finance executives. And that's not a knock against the Office of Finance. It's just to say that there's a lot going on that goes beyond the analytical indicators or reports or other finance initiatives. And it's really just an understanding that I think needs to be bridged. So again, those two concerns is really the balance between cost discipline and ambition, which IT tries to drive a lot, sometimes probably too much, but that's for another day. And then the second concern would be that mutual lack of understanding. But I'd offer that the CFO-CIO relationship, it can be awesome, but it does require a shift in mindset. It requires that increase in mutual understanding. And more specifically, it requires a relationship where trust in each other's core competencies allows for unity of effort in terms of organizational goals.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think of the notion of comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, respect for mutual disciplines. And with that in mind, Renee, I'd love to hear your perspective on this question.
Sure, great. Well, I loved Joe's answer around it really is focused on that balance of cost discipline and, solving strategic objectives. And I would take one more step before that. Whenever there's a IT project here, the question I always ask is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What is the business issue that we're trying to solve? A lot of times, particularly with no offense, but with tech folks, they get very enamored with the, what's new and cool, and a lot of that is great, but sometimes it takes time to understand what's the practical application, how are we going to use it, do we have that need, and really, I find the most successful projects are when we work collaboratively with the CIO and his team to make sure that we are in fact solving a problem. And going back to what Peter was saying, one of the big investments that we've been making at CBSI is really around more and more data automation and data analytics. And so making sure that, we partner with the CIOs to jointly come to the decision of what is the best tool or technology that's available in the marketplace for us, as opposed to, someone making the decision for us. We, as an internet company, we're always very focused on looking at what is the newest technology out in the marketplace. We have limited resources, so we want to make sure that we are making good bets when we are, aligning ourselves with vendors, because this is a multi-year project. And so making sure that we partner with the CIO on those decisions and ultimately implementations is important, because we're going to be stuck with some of these tools and technologies for a while. So we want to make sure that we're making a joint decision that's going to move the company or the business forward.
Well, thank you very much, Renee. Gary, continuing along the senior finance executive point of view, what would you bring following up on what your fellow panelists have said?
I think both Joe and Renee make good points. And I really do think, if I boil it down to two things Joe and Renee both said, I think it's that simple. And it really comes down to availability of funding, as one of the things that can get in the way, right? Because you don't have unlimited resources. And then the second piece is, what Renee just said, is that, my experience, and this doesn't mean that there aren't organizations that work differently, that my experience has been that whether folks who work in technology, whether that's IT or even, product engineering groups and other types of companies, tend to get really excited about technology. And that's why they work there, and I think that's fantastic, and you want people to get excited about technology. But they don't always value the return on that technology. And it goes back to what I said in question number 2. It's really trying to, and Joe used the word balance as well, it's really trying to balance, is there an adequate return for the type of technology? Because most technologies these days, there certainly are technologies that are there to support IT, mainly on the infrastructure side. But most of the technology investments are on the application side. And those applications are there to help different functions or the company operate better. And if they're there to help the company operate better, there should be some direct correlation to either efficiency, which is buzzword for lower cost, or growth in revenue and net profit. And there needs to be a return on investment. And I've never really met CFOs who aren't open to great return on investments. I've always said in every company I've worked in, our capital budgets are relevant. If you got a program that has a great payback, bring it on, because we need to do that. And the same applies for technology. I think the challenge in technology is it's not always as crystal clear where that investment comes from. And the secondary piece of it is, and this has become a bigger issue, especially with centralization of IT budgets, which we do here and happens in a lot of companies, is the investment happens in IT and the benefit might be within a function or across a function. And when it comes to getting everyone else on the C team to sign up for either higher revenues or more profit or lower cost or some combination of the three associated with that investment, it's not always so easy to get people to be completely accountable. And to the extent you can really drive accountability and a willingness to sign up for those things, there'd be a lot more willingness to sign up for a lot more IT spend. But it's like any other investment, people are a little afraid to stick their neck out at times. And I think that's one of the things that gets in the way.
Thank you, Gary. Before we move on to our next question, just briefly, Peter, again, recapitulating your observations briefly about reasons CFOs encounter obstacles to collaborating with CIOs.
Yes, and just quickly, because I think clearly we're talking about relationships. Somebody has already used the trust word. This is about a human relationship. As I've mentioned, I think empathy and understanding is important. The ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to understand their priorities. And one of the key things, I think, is for the two leaders to make each other aware of their constraints and challenges. I mean, do CFOs really understand all the implications and constraints of running technology in a large organization? Equally, do CIOs understand the pressure that perhaps the CFO is under from the CEO or from members of the board in terms of results, in terms of operating margin, or in terms of maybe how the organization manages its external reporting and what data it reports, and so on. So I think it really, empathy is important, the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes and really build that strong relationship.
Thank you very much, Peter. Here's a key question that I want to make sure we have time to address, and I'd love to hear perspective from Renee and then Gary, and then Peter, returning to you briefly. New types of skills CFOs are expecting finance teams to develop. For finance teams, the extent to which attaining proficiency with these skills translates to more productive working relationships with IT. So starting with Renee, and then Gary, then Peter, I want to hear your thoughts on this question.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we really focus on here at CBSI is making sure that we have strong business support from FP&A for our various business leaders, including the CIO and the CTO. And that's making sure that the people assigned to that really understand the aspects of technology and particularly the costs of it. I really like Peter's recommendation of embedding people in the teams. One of the things that we've seen in the last year that really brings this point home around understanding is we are transitioning all of our infrastructure from a traditional data center environment to the cloud. And one of the big issues there, anyone who's gone through that transition, is you're suddenly trading off CapEx for operating expenses. And so having someone on the finance side who understands that and can work with the CIO and the CTO to make sure they understand the implications on budget and timing has been really instrumental, as well as understanding the cloud strategy and how those costs work, things around reserved instances. I mean, if you've gone through this, you know it's somewhat complex. So having someone on the finance side who is really interested in understanding that environment so that they can provide the best support has been really critical for us. So that's a real-time example of something that we're going through right now. The other thing is, we are working across multiple divisions, not only within Interactive, but with CBS Corporation. And so embracing things like collaboration tools, we use the Google Suite here, it makes us do real-time analysis a lot better so multiple people can participate in analysis, and our CIO was really instrumental in helping move that along and is now trying to get people on the corporate side to embrace that as well, because we're the internet division, so we're the scrappy little tech company. We're used to these things. But sometimes people in more traditional businesses are a little slower to adapt to some of these things. So making sure that we have the training and the tools so that people are comfortable with it on the finance side, so that way they can sort of continue to add value, but in a new, the digitization of finance that Peter talked about. That environment is something that people need to be willing to learn, and we want to make sure that we bring them along with the right training and tools so that they can be successful.
Thank you, Renee. Now, Gary, as I transition to you, I just want to note, in considering this question, when we talk about types of skills, not necessarily the use of particular pieces of software, but more skills that perhaps even a few years ago, CFOs did not necessarily expect their finance teams to develop, but they need to develop now. So, Gary, I'd love to hear your perspective on this question.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure there's been a revolutionary change. I think there's been more of an evolutionary change. Unless you want to talk about things like, robotics, which is becoming more common, and I think even some of those robotic skills are more within the IT world than they are within the financial world. And certainly within the IT world, having ownership for both IT and finance, I see a lot of new applications where we require new skills. Whether that's, whether the software itself is necessarily new or not, as we evolve as a company and invest in different applications, we need, additional people in those areas. Even to use things like something as like SAP, as they come out with, have come out with S4. There's parts of S4 where we just simply don't have the in-house talent that we've had to go out and recruit, or it might be with Salesforce.com or something along those lines. Within the world of finance, I still believe, and Renee started talking about FP&A, that the evolution of FP&A is a skill that's more important than any technological skill, and that's really having people within finance, within FP&A, who really understand the business, really understand the functions, certainly understanding IT costs if you're supporting IT, so that you can become involved in trying to drive, really good decision making, and then getting involved in making those things happen. I mean, that skill to me trumps, all technological skills. I've seen folks. I've been in finance now for close to 30 years, and even 30 years ago, even though the technology was different, the ability and willingness to dive into data and do data manipulation and bring data together in a way that you can actually see opportunities or issues and manage things and track things, that still exists as a very strong skill set. The technology has evolved, so there are better tools for doing that, but it's from a requirement, it's really been there, for as long as I've been in finance.
Thank you very much, Gary. And that is a key point, that it's not just facility or knowledge of particular pieces of software, and also the evolution of the finance team in terms of its responsibilities. Now, Peter, I'd love to hear your perspective here, but also as we prepare to wrap up our discussion within the next 5 minutes or so. In answering this question, I'd also like to give you the opportunity, Peter, to outline what you think are some key takeaways. So in answering this question, in addition to answering this question, I'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of key takeaways attendees should keep in mind.
Yes, of course, and I can be very, very quick on the first question. I mean, I think process engineering skills, process re-engineering skills are going to be extremely important. Finance processes tend to be complex. You can take them to the cloud, you can automate them, but you also need to re-engineer them. So that's going to be a really, really important skill and an important dynamic with IT. In terms of just the kind of final thoughts, I would go back to quite a soft but just a people issue. Finance leaders thinking about their own personal leadership style. We're operating in very uncertain times. In times of uncertainty, people can kind of fall back on accepted practices, business as usual, old, traditional orthodoxies within the finance arena. But I think for the future, you really have to have a willingness to embrace creative solutions, fresh ideas, and show that you have a bold vision for the future of finance. So I think it's something about personal leadership style.
Thank you very much, Peter. We have talked about this, so we can keep this relatively brief because we have addressed it to some extent. But starting with Gary, returning to Gary, and then Joe, I'd love to hear your maybe a quick example, but also want to hear your thoughts about key takeaways for attendees. So starting with Gary, and then Joe, an example of a best practice that we may not have already addressed, and also key takeaways for attendees.
So not a lot of magic here, but we've mentioned a lot of things. Certainly, having a good company culture and certainly having strong financials so that there's a little less stress in the organization, helps. And then structure around objectives and alignment and reward system also helps, to better align folks at the C-level and below. But beyond some of those big picture elements. It really comes down to simple, good old-fashioned relationship building, which is about, getting to know people, listening to them, really listening to them and wanting to know, what's important to them, finding ways to, both not just collaborate, but also, make compromises where you can in your mutual best interests, and then working it constantly and building that relationship. So again, not a lot of magic here to doing this, but it is a bit of work.
Oh, thank you very much, Gary. And Joe, likewise, an example of a best practice and key takeaways for attendees.
Yeah, I would say a best practice would be to help folks across the aisle in IT understand what data-driven decisions really look like. I think the Office of Finance is particularly attuned to understanding inputs and outputs and creating balance, if you will, from the early days of accounting. So debits and credits, you have to have a balance at the end. And sometimes making decisions with gut is maybe interesting, but it's rarely successful. So I think informing and educating and mentoring on data-driven decisions would be extremely helpful. And then also to channel Stephen Covey, the emotional bank account. Make sure that you give regular deposits into that account across that relationship spectrum. And I think that would be my biggest takeaway for all the attendees as well, is that, and you've heard a lot of it, and it sounds really fluffy and hard to quantify, but relationships really do matter. So take time to make regular deposits into those emotional bank accounts of your peers, and you'll be surprised how much compound interest accrues over time.
Very well said. So very much appreciate that, Joe. And Renee, just want to hear your thoughts on key takeaways. We've heard your fellow panelists' thoughts on key takeaways. Love to hear your thoughts on key takeaways before we pose our third of 3 polling questions.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what both Greg and Joe have said. I think the key message here is it's all about strong collaboration between the finance organization and the IT organization, ensuring that there's alignment on goals and objectives, and frequent check-ins in terms of progress, and measuring through some mutually agreed on KPIs to ensure that investments are on track and generating a return.
Absolutely, and that's well said. Thank you, Renee. We want to now pose our third of 3 polling questions. Our third of 3 polling questions asks attendees to indicate within what time frame, if any, your finance team, or rather your company, intends to identify opportunities to improve collaboration between your finance and IT teams. What you're welcome to do is select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then click on the Submit button so we can record your response. From top to bottom, the choices are your company is already doing so. This year, next year, your company has no plans, or if you don't know, that's fine. You can select the radio button next to I don't know. Again, we do ask that you select the radio button that corresponds to your answer to the question within what time frame, if any, your company intends to identify opportunities to improve collaboration between your finance and IT teams. And what we'll do is give attendees just a few more seconds to respond. We'll then reveal how you have responded, and then we will wrap up. And what we can see, what is readily apparent, and kudos, by the way, to attendees, we see that more than a third have indicated your company is already doing so, and close to a quarter have indicated you're planning to do so this year. So that's very encouraging. For those of you who don't know, we hope this webcast has been helpful in helping to reboot CFO-CIO collaboration. And with that in mind, what we'd like to do is let you know what will follow from this webcast. First of all, I would point out that this webcast will be available later this week within the webcast section of CFO.com. At that point, you'll be able to view and listen to a streaming archive of our webcast, download a PDF document comprising slides, click on links to view information about upcoming events that offer the opportunity to hear from and meet finance leaders in person, and if you're eligible, retrieve your CPE certificate. We've received great questions from attendees. We'll plan to follow up on any remaining questions after our webcast. Also, we would note we invite you to complete an online feedback survey that will appear at the end of our webcast. The survey will appear in a separate browser window that you'll be able to view if you've turned off your pop-up blocker within your web browser. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Once again, we want to thank our distinguished guests, Peter, Joe, Renee, and Gary, for such an engaging and informative discussion, and we want to thank attendees for joining us for our webcast, Rebooting CFO-CIO Collaboration, brought to you by Argyle, the publisher of CFO Magazine and CFO.com, and sponsored by Workday. We thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.